Today we're going to be learning Pesachim Daf Samach Vav. Today's daf is dedicated by Erica Kolach in commemoration of the 24th year outside of her father, Richard Gluby, Hillel ben Yosef Kalman Zichrono Lebracha. Although we have very little Jewish education or practice, when I became observant, he took it as a challenge to make me always feel welcome at home. He believed in forging your own path and would be very proud that his daughter and granddaughter are learning Gemara and keeping up with Daf Yomi. Okay, we're going to start now from the very beginning of the page. I just want to refresh your memory because we're in the middle of a discussion. It's always tough when the daf ends in the middle of a discussion. So we'll go back briefly. We had the Mishnah that discussed which parts of the Korban Pesach, and that's going to be our topic for today, although we will get very sidetracked into the very famous story. Okay, so story coming of Hillel's session to the Nisiut, to become the Nasi, what do you call it, the president or the head. The leader from the B'nai B'Tera. We're going to see a very famous story. And from there, we're going to get into also all sorts of traits that one should not or should be careful of that could lead to all sorts of issues. So we'll get there also. But right now, we're in the middle of a discussion about does the Korban Pesach and what elements of the Korban Pesach override Shabbat. So obviously, the slaughtering and anything that's necessary. But what about things that are done that could have been done before Shabbat? Okay, so now we're going to have a discussion in the Mishnah between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis. Rabbi Eliezer thinks that they're allowed, and the rabbis think not. We start with Rabbi Yeshua. I want to give you a little historical perspective. Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua are both second-generation Tanaim. So the discussion starts off with two people at the same level. Then in comes Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was a student of both of them, actually. So Rabbi Akiva is coming in, and he's in a different position because he's a student. So you have to remember that when you have these discussions. What's interesting is Rabbi Eliezer calls both Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Akiva by their first name, Yoshua and Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva, you'll see, calls Rabbi Eliezer Rebbe because he says rabbi. So you see the difference of generations, but yet it doesn't stop Rabbi Akiva from questioning Rabbi Eliezer. And in fact, we're going to see a possible reason why he's pushing him. So we'll get back to that soon. We started with this discussion, and Rabbi Eliezer says his first thing is there's a kavachomer, and I brought it on the sheet for today so you can see from the beginning. He says, isn't it a kavachomer if shchita, which is deoraita, overrides Shabbat, then all of the things that are derabanan, like carrying it out from the tchum or something like that, would be obviously permitted. To which Rabbi Yeshua says, what do you mean? On Yom Tov, we're allowed to do deoraitas for ochal nefesh, but we can't bring food from outside the tchum, for example. We're not allowed to do other things for food purposes that could have been done yesterday. To which he says, Mazi Yoshua, what are you bringing me? Such a proof. You can see Rabbi Eliezer, this Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkanus, the famous. So he says, what are you doing? Why are you bringing me a proof from Reshut to mitzvah? I'm talking about mitzvah. You're talking about being able to eat on Yom Tov. I understand you can't do the Rabban. But here we're talking about the temple. The temple is so central. To which Rabbi Akiva pitches in and says, I'll prove it from Haza'ah. That's where we ended yesterday. He said you can't sprinkle the purification waters on someone who is in their seventh day of being impure to a dead person and they want to eat the Korban Pesach tonight. You're not allowed to do that if it comes out on Shabbat because that's fixing someone, and fixing is a problem, even though it's only D'Rabbanan. To which Rabbi Eliezer answers, that's exactly my question. Something like Haza'ah. I disagree with you about Haza'ah. I think you can do the purification waters exactly for this reason because it's enabling you to do a sacrifice. That's where we ended. So now comes Rabbi Akiva and he says, Amar lo Rabbi Akiva o chiluf. This is a very strange thing that he does. He says, I can take what you're saying and switch it. Okay, it's not exactly what you're saying. You'll see in a minute, and come up with the exact opposite logical conclusion. What he's saying is basically, I'm going to take the fact that you're making this kavachomer and saying a logical argument, and I'm going to say if one takes a logical argument, you could take it in a different direction and prove that you can't even slaughter the Korban Pesach on Shabbat, which everybody knows isn't the case. So he says, O chiluf, I can reverse your kavachomer. Ma'im haza'ah shehi mishum shvut eina dochet Shabbat. If the sprinkling the waters doesn't override Shabbat, now this is a little weird because Rabbi Eliezer just said, I think it does. So hold off for 1 minute on that question. Shchita shehi mishum malacha eino din shelo titchet Shabbat. If you want to learn one from the other, I'll learn it in the opposite direction. You want to say if shchita is dochet, then haza'ah is also dochet, right? Then you can sprinkle the waters. But I would say the opposite. If haza'ah does not override, then maybe shchita doesn't override. As if you can't do derabbanans in the temple, then obviously they can't do something that's forbidden by Torah law. Now, what's he doing here? Didn't Rabbi Eliezer say, I disagree with you about sprinkling? I think you can. And here Rabbi Akiva is starting off with, you can't. So on Daf Samach Tet, we're going to see that Rabbi Eliezer himself holds, not like he says in this Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer himself holds you cannot sprinkle the waters. And it seems that it must be that Rabbi Akiva is trying to remember he's his student. This is why it's important to understand. He wants to remind Rabbi Eliezer of a halacha that he taught them that you can't sprinkle the waters. And he's trying gently to remind Rabbi Akiva, you taught us this, but he doesn't want to say it explicitly because it's lack of respect to say that to your rabbi. So he's trying to remind him by kind of repeating it again and then saying, well, your logic also doesn't make sense either. So, right, this is a little different from Abaye and Rav Yosef. Remember, Rav Yosef always forgets his Torah and Abaye always reminds him, but you're the one who taught us. So Rabbi Akiva didn't want to go that approach. He thought that it was disrespectful, so he kind of sneaks it in. So Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer, Akiva, akarta ma shekatuv b'Torah. He says, that's a ridiculous conclusion to come to. In the end, right, you're saying that shechita is not going to override Shabbat, but you would never make a kal vachomer like that because it's an explicit law in the Torah that it overrides Shabbat. B'mo'ado, what's the drasha? Because it says, in Bamidbar, chapter 9, it says, Vayasu b'nei Israel et haPesach b'mo'ado. They did the Korban Pesach in its time. This is in the second year in the desert, right after they got out of Egypt. They did the Korban Pesach when they were supposed to. So what did they learn? B'mo'ado, in its time. That means bein b'chol, bein Shabbat, whether it's chol, whether it's Shabbat. Amarlo, Rebbe, haveli mo'ed le'elu ki mo'ed l'shchita. He says to him, wait a minute. You want to say, based on that since Korban Pesach overrides Shabbat, also sprinkling the waters would override Shabbat. But I'm going to prove to you that not. Why is that? Because haveli mo'ed le'elu, show me that there's a specific date that you're supposed to do the sprinkling of the waters. There isn't. It happens for each individual person. There's a specific day. But there's no specific day in the calendar that says this is the day everyone has to sprinkle the purification waters. So when it comes to Moed l'Shchita, when it comes to Korban Pesach, there's a very specific day that you're supposed to slaughter the Korban Pesach, and that's why we're going to allow it to override Shabbat. But there's no specific day to sprinkle the waters, and that's why you can't learn one from the other. Notice Rabbi Akiva gets the last word in, and not only that, but the Mishnah even ends with Rabbi Akiva and says, Klal amar Rabbi Akiva, he said a general rule, Kol melacha she'efshar la'asota me'erev Shabbat eina dochet haShabbat. Shchita she'ei efshar la'asota me'erev Shabbat dochet haShabbat. Only things that couldn't be done yesterday are allowed to override Shabbat. Anything that could have been done for Shabbat before Shabbat does not override Shabbat. Okay, so here starts our famous story. Tanu Rabbanan. Okay, and you can read flashback, Shuli Mishkin's article. I'm not sure if it's up yet, but it will be up later this morning, where she gives some of the historical perspective on this very important story. Halacha zonit alman b'nei b'tera. Okay, big question asked, how on earth could this be? But the b'nei b'tera didn't know this halacha. What halacha did they not know? Pam achat chal arba'asar liot b'Shabbat. There was a year when the 14th fell out on Shabbat. Shachachu v'lo yadu in Pesach dochet haShabbat im lav. Okay, they're living in the beginning of the first century. There's still a temple, and they don't know what the halacha is. Are we supposed to slaughter the Korban Pesach or not? Didn't know. It's crazy. How could they not have known? It's a very good question. Okay, so Shuli gets into this also in her article. How could they possibly not have known? Amru, klum yesh adam sheyodeh im Pesach dochet haShabbat im lav. So what's their response? They said, let's go ask around. Is there anybody who knows this halacha? Amru lahem adam echad yesh. There's one person, she'ala mi Bavel. He came from Babylonia. Okay, already ding, 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 right? This is clearly one of those stories where they're relating to the Babylonians versus the people in Israel. And this one is kind of trying to say, right, the guy who comes from Babylonia is better than the ones in Israel because look, the guy from Babylonia, he's the one who knows the law. Okay, so here goes. There's a guy from Bavel and Hillel HaBavli Shmo. He's called Hillel the Bavli. Okay, we know him as Hillel, simply, not Hillel the Bavli. He's the one who appears in many stories. He's the one who argues with Shammai all the time. He's the one who was going through the skylight to listen to Torah and was stuck outside the Beit Midrash. And he became the student eventually of Shmaya and of Talyon, who were one of the Zugot, right, the last of the Zugot. sorry, they're the last of the Zugot, Shammai and Hillel, the one before them. Right, he's the one who's always got a good attitude. Remember, they try to get him angry on Erev Shabbat, and they come and ask these nitpicky questions, and he never gets angry. And they ask him, teach me all the Torah, regel achat, and he does, right? He's, always we look at Hillel as this great leader. And most importantly for this story, he's the one who becomes the Nasi, and it becomes dynastic. And all his children, there's the Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, they're all from the family of Hillel. So let's see what happens here. So they say there's Hillel from Bavel and Shishimesh Negdolei Hador. He sat and learned Torah with the two greatest of our generation, Shmaya v'Avtalyon. V'yodea im Pesach dochet haShabbat im lav. And he's the guy who knows whether Pesach overrides Shabbat or not. Shalchu v'karulo. So they call him in. Amrulo, klum ata yodea im Pesach dochet haShabbat im lav. They say, do you know the answer to this question? Does it override Shabbat or not? Bringing the Korban Pesach. Amar lahem, v'chi Pesach echad yesh lanu b'shana shedochet haShabbat. What? Do we only have one Pesach a year now? Right? It's kind of funny. What he's saying is, what? Almost he's probably a little bit referencing, did this never happen that you guys don't remember? Obviously, it must have happened. The Pesach came out on Erev Shabbat, but it's not really what he says. You'll see what he says in a minute. He says, because of course, there is only one Pesach each year. There isn't more than one Pesach a year. So it's a little bit weird what he's saying. So he says, we have more than 200 Pesachs a year that override Shabbat. Now, what are you talking about? We don't bring Pesach 200 times a year, but what he obviously means is we have all these other sacrifices we bring every Shabbat, the Korban Tamid. There's special sacrifices for Shabbat. We're always bringing things on Shabbat. So why are you even asking this question? Amrulo minayin lecha. So you wonder, maybe they're a little bit testing him because they say, well, what's your proof for this, right? We want a proof. Amar lahem ne'emar moado b'Pesach v'ne'emar moado b'Tamid. We saw that pasuk just before. It says, bim moado, they did the Pesach in its proper time. And then it says, v'ne'emar moado b'tamid. By the Korban Tamid, it says, this is in Bamidbar Perek Kafchet, where it lists all the different sacrifices. It says, Savet b'nei Israel, command the Jewish people, v'amarta alehem, you should say to them, et korbani lachmi li'ishai, reach nichochi tishmeru la'akriv li bim moado. Okay, this is about the Korban Tamid, and it says, make sure to do it in its proper time. So here you have in its proper time by Pesach and in its proper time by the Korban Tamid. Just like, okay, so let's read it inside. Ma moado ha'amor b'tamid dochet haShabbat. Just like the Korban Tamid overrides Shabbat. Af moado ha'amor b'Pesach dochet haShabbat. Okay, so this is what you call, what type of learning is this? This is the, what we call Gzera Shava. Okay, you have two words that appear in two different places. We can learn from one to the other. One thing to remember about Gzera Shava is you can only teach it if you learned it from your rabbi, if you have a tradition about it. You can't make up your own Gzera Shava, and that's different from a Kal V'chomer, which is logical reasoning, which anyone can offer their own logical reasoning. Ve'od Kal V'chomer, and that's why he goes into now a Kal V'chomer. There's another source, by the way, of this disagreement between them, and there it lists that he used 7 different methods that the Torah is nidreshet b'hem. We know there's a whole bunch of different ways you can darshan the Torah, and he used 7 different methods to prove this. Okay, you can almost see like they're almost testing him, right? And he's trying to prove, look how much I know. So he brings them, right? Gzera Shava is not enough. I'm going to bring you also a Kal V'chomer. Later, the Gemara is going to say, why did he bring both? And we'll see. V'od Kal V'chomer. Uma tamid she'en anush karet dochet haShabbat. Pesach she'anush karet eno din shedochet haShabbat. So now the Korban Tamid, you don't get karet for, and yet it overrides Shabbat. That means it's less severe than Pesach. If you don't do the Korban Pesach, you get karet, you get cut off. So, all the more so, Pesach she'anush karet, right? Wouldn't it be obvious? Eno din shedochet haShabbat. Pesach is much stricter. So he brings them a Gzera Shava from the Tamid, and then he brings them a logical argument from the Korban Tamid. So once you take for granted that the Korban Tamid is overridden, then you can assume that also Pesach. Okay, so now, miyad, what's the reaction? Miyad hoshivuhu barosh uminuhu nasi alehem. Immediately they said, you're going to be our nasi. You clearly know a lot of Torah. Okay, there's a lot of questions to ask here. Okay, I don't have answers to all of them, but this is because you answered one question, so that makes you the nasi, right? It seems a little bit strange. I think also this story, if we look from perspective, okay, zooming out, and we look at the end of the story, well, we're not at the end yet, but at this part at the end, it's very possible that what they were doing was they were trying to say, how did it become that Hillel became the Nasi? And then they told a story that shows he showed how great he was. And from there he became the Nasi, because the Nasi, okay, what's interesting about it became dynastic, but there's always this struggle, especially in those times about, and even in the time of Sefer Melachim, right? You saw the dynasties didn't always work very well. And the seesaw between dynastic versus being worthy. So what they wanted to show us, even though the Nisiut is dynastic, it originated that he was worthy of it. And they wanted to bring the story to show, look, he knew something nobody else knew. And also you have this Bavel, Eretz Israel, right? The Bavlim trying to say, oh, look, it's the people from the outside that came in and knew more than the other people. It's just very interesting in general, the story. You could do a lot with it. There's a lot of history in here. And as I said, Shuli gets into the historical perspective of it. There's other things going on. Okay, well, we'll keep going on and then maybe we'll go back and say some more. So now what happens? He became the head, and what does he do? So he starts teaching all the Hilchot HaPesach. I see, by the way, Ruth, it's good you're pointing this out. How did they not know who he was until now? It's also very interesting, right? From the story, it seems like they didn't, right? There's a lot. I mean, I'm not mentioning everything. I'll kind of throw a few things, but yes, I agree. I didn't even think about that it's clear they didn't even know who he was until that day. And then all of a sudden he comes in and they make him in charge, which is a little bit strange. There's also the issue of Shmaya and Avtalyon coming from converts, and maybe there's something about who's in, who's out, right? There's talks about the outcast, right? Hillel's the outcast, because he's the Bavli, he's the outsider, right? As someone who made Aliyah, I've been in situations where sometimes you sort of feel like you're the outsider, you come with a different perspective and your perspective is new and different for people, but they don't always accept it because you're an outsider. It also specifically here, you would think that people from Israel who are native Israelis would know better what goes on in the temple. And it's he who happens to know better than them. There's also things, I see things going in the chats. These are things that all come up. I can't get into everything. There's a thing about how every 14 years it happens. So how could they not have remembered? First of all, sometimes people could forget every 14 years, or the calendar wasn't really set then anyway. So it's not necessarily clear that that's what happened. And it could be, it really maybe didn't happen for many, many years. There's lots of questions here and more questions than answers. But now comes the surprising part of the story. So what happens? So he's teaching Hilchot Pesach all day long. This Hillel, who we see in such a positive light all the time, and such a mensch, right? You think of a mensch, that's Hillel. Patient. He starts to mock them. And what does he say? Or not exactly mock them, but put them down. And he says, he says, what's going on here? I'm an outsider and I became in charge of you. That's a poor reflection on yourselves. Laziness. Interesting. We had the laziness with the kat atzlanit, right? It was laziness, he says. Because you didn't, what didn't you do? You didn't sit and learn with Shmaya and Avtalyon. If you sat and learned properly with Shmaya and Avtalyon, you would have known the halach and you never would have come to this. Amrulo. So what's the reaction? No, when you hear that, right? There's nothing you can say, basically. You're stuck. So instead of, now you have to wonder why they did this, but instead of answering him back, they throw a question at him. That's why I said before, I think they're kind of quizzing him, right? Before they said, oh, you said that, that's very nice, but what's your source? And now they throw another question at him and they say, Amrulo, Rebbe, shachach v'lo hevi sakim me'erev Shabbat ma'u. What if they forgot the knife? What happens then? And this is what we saw before. That's our case in our Mishnah. Can you bring the knife? You should have brought it yesterday, but you forgot. Are you allowed to bring it? So what's his response? Amar lahen, halachazo shamati v'shachachti. That I learned, but I forgot. You see, he gets it right back at him. And he mocked them, and now he gets, right, he's stuck, and he all of a sudden doesn't remember the halacha. And what's his response? How are we going to figure out the halacha? And this is a fascinating line, which comes up in many places in the Gemara. Hanach lehen liYisrael im ein nevi'im hen b'nei nevi'im hen. Leave the Jews. It doesn't really mean leave the Jews. That's literally, but it means the Jewish people know what they're doing. If they're not prophets themselves, they're the sons of prophets. That means go look at what they're doing. And from what they're doing, we can infer what the halachic truth is. right? We can see what goes on the street and we can learn halacha from there. So let's wait till tomorrow and let's see what they do. And then we'll know. Limachal, the next day, whoever was bringing their lamb to the Beit HaMikdash stuck the knife into the wool of the lamb. And whoever was bringing a goat, they stuck the knife in between the horns of the animal. He saw it and then he said, oh, that reminds me, now I remember what the halacha is. This is what I learned from Shmaya and Avtayon, that in fact, this is what you do. If you forget it, you can do it in this kind of manner. Okay, so that's our story. We're now going to have the structure is 4 questions on different details of the story. And then we're going to go back to this issue of midot, and we're going to learn from Hillel what you shouldn't do, right? It's interesting. You'd think that this story, and that's why the story has a very interesting twist, because you think the story is coming to say, Hillel is so great, and that's why he became the leader, and it explains that's why he became the Nasi. And then it shows you, boom, right? Look what, it's almost like saying power corrupts, right? He started off, he was great, and he knew everything, and we have all these great stories about Hillel, but as soon as he became the Nasi, on that day already, he becomes arrogant, and look at what he does to the people. Now, again, this could be a story about Hillel, or many of these stories, they tell a story in such a way to criticize the rabbis of their own generation, meaning this story could have been written later to criticize their own leaders and not necessarily Hillel. They're just saying, this is possible end to that story, which would then show, this is how you're supposed to behave. It's also sometimes the rabbi's way of just saying things, not necessarily that the story actually happened in this way. Anyway, like I said, there's a lot, you can go in depth into this, but we're gonna keep going. So Amar Ma, Ne'emar Moado bePesach, v'Ne'emar Moado beTamid. Ma Moado hamor beTamid doche et haShabbat, af Moado hamor bePesach doche et haShabbat. Remember what he says? I'm going to learn this from Gzeira Shava, from the word Moado. So because in the Korban Tamid it overrides Shabbat, also in Pesach. So then they say, v'Tamid gufo minalan didache Shabbat. What about the Tamid? Where do we know that it overrides Shabbat? Ilem amishum dichtiv be Moado. Pesach nami haktiv be moado, ela moado lo mashmale. Hachanami moado lo mashmale. They say it can't be they learn it from the word moado, which is probably what you thought. Moado means on that day, whether it's Shabbat or not. Because if you learned it from moado, then you could learn it from Pesach be moado, and you wouldn't need to learn Pesach from Tamid. So just like by Pesach, moado doesn't teach you that. Moado only teaches it to you because we learn comparison. Moado appears by Pesach, Moado appears by Tamid. Since Moado b'Tamid on its day means on its day, even on Shabbat, therefore also by Pesach, but not from the word Moado, because the word Moado taught it would have taught it by Pesach also. So therefore, what did they say? Ela amarcha olat Shabbat b'Shabbato al olat Tamid. When it talks about the sacrifices on Shabbat, it says you're supposed to bring the Korban Olah for Shabbat, in addition to the olat Tamid that you also bring on Shabbat, which means obviously you bring the Korban Tamid on Shabbat, otherwise you wouldn't be able to bring it if you couldn't slaughter it. So therefore, Michlal, from here one can infer, Olad Tamid Kreva b'Shabbat. So they learn it from there. Once they learn it from there, then they take this comparison of a word that appears by Tamid and a word that appears by Pesach, and from there we can learn from one to the other. Now we're going to talk about this Kal V'chomer. Amar Ma, ve'od Kal V'chomer. What's the Kal V'chomer? Again, they're just repeating the Braita. Uma Tamid she'en anush karet dochet haShabbat, Pesach she'anush karet eno din shedochet haShabbat. Right? Wouldn't you say if Pesach you get karet for not doing it and the Tamid you don't? Obviously, then if the Tamid overrides Shabbat, also the Pesach would. Ikalamifrach. One could question and say, Ma Tamid shekain tadil v'kalil. The Korban Tamid is every day, which always, and we've talked about this many times in the last chapter, how that's something that's very significant, and it's kalil. The entire thing gets burned. The Korban Pesach doesn't get burned in its entirety. So here you have two stringencies that are by the Tamid that aren't by Pesach, so therefore you can knock out the Kal V'chomer. So now they say, even though in the order of the Braita it said he mentioned Gzeira Shava, and then he gave the Kal V'chomer, they say here, Kal V'chomer amar luhu b'reisha u'perchua. First he brought the Kal V'chomer and they knocked it down. They said basically what we just suggested. They're assuming that some conversation happened that wasn't recorded, which is that he brought the Kal V'chomer. They said, we knock out your logic, because there's a chumrah, a stringency also about the Korban Tamid that doesn't exist by Pesach. And therefore, Hadar Amalihu Gzeira Shava. And then he brought them the Gzeira Shava. So now in the world of drashot, which is stronger? Gzera shava is stronger. First of all, it comes from a masoret. Second of all, logical arguments, as we know, we've had many kavachomers that you can flip the logic of. So logic, you can always try to, there's always some other way to look at it. So therefore, gzera shava is better. So now they ask the question, if you're going to assume, first he said the kavachomer, they knocked it out, and then he brought this gzera shava, doesn't make sense. Because if he had gzera shava, then he should have learned the gzera shava. And why did he bring the kavachomer? It's a much stronger drasha, the gzera shava. He was talking according to their approach. Now remember what I told you. Gzera shava you can only have if you have a tradition about it. So obviously they didn't have a tradition about this gzera shava, the B'nai B'Tera, because if they did, they would have known the halacha. So because of that, they say, Bishlama, so he was saying to them, according to you, Bishlama, I understand gzera shava lo gamaritu. You don't have a gzera shava. You don't have a tradition. You didn't learn this gzera shava. So this one isn't in your repertoire. Because we all know that you can't make up your own gzera shava. Ella kavachomer. So therefore, he brought him a kavachomer to say, listen, I have a tradition about gzera shava, but I'm going to start with a logical argument because I know you don't have that tradition. So if you want to go according to your approach, if you don't have that tradition, I'll give you a logical argument. And then, right, because da'adam dam me'atzmo, anyone can offer a logical opinion, and therefore you should agree at least with my kavachomer if you don't agree with my gzera shava. Amrule kavachomer prichahu. But then they said, listen, your kavachomer doesn't stand up. We can knock it out. And then he had no choice but to bring his gzera shava. That was the first two questions. Okay, now we're moving to two more questions, which are both about the last line of the Braita, where what did the people do? They had the animal carry the knife on its body. So two problems with that. Amar mar, lemachar mishpes chotalet tochev lo b'tzamro gdi tochev lo ben karnaf v'haka avid avodah b'kodashim. They're using sanctified animals to do work. Work hard labor, but it's using them to benefit, that they're bringing the knife for them. You can't use something that's sanctified to carry something for you. It's sanctified. So they say ki Hillel, interesting. It goes like Hillel, right? The whole story is about Hillel. They must have held like Hillel. Tanya. It says in the following Braita. Amru al Hillel, mi'amav lo ma'al adam ba'olato. Ela mivi'ah chulin la'azara u'makdisha v'somech yadav alav v'shochata. People don't bring to the, what Hillel said is, you don't bring your, we've talked many times, remember the whole lishma, lo lishma, when you designate your animal, it already becomes sanctified for that sacrifice. So Hillel had told people, or what they said about Hillel, in the time of Hillel, nobody had a problem of misusing sanctified animals. Why is that? Because people would bring chulin la'azara. If I would take an animal for the Korban Pesach, I wouldn't say I'm taking this for a Korban Pesach. I would just take it, walk it to the temple without designating it for a specific sacrifice so that it doesn't become sanctified, and not just Korban Pesach, anything. And then I would get to the Azara. I would get to the, here we don't mean the inner Azara, but right, probably, or somewhere around the Azara. Umakdisha. Only when you get there would people sanctify it. And that was a good way to avoid misuse of consecrated property. And then he would do the smicha. That's on a korban that needs smicha. Not all of them do. And you would slaughter it. So that's the first question. The first question is, how did they do avoda with sanctified items? And the answer, they didn't sanctify it until they actually got to the temple. In which case, on the way to the temple, the animals could carry it because they weren't sanctified. So now they say, wait a minute, there's a problem with that question, with that answer. What is it? Pesach b'Shabbat, hechimatzi makdishle. But then there'd be no reason to sanctify the animal. Yeah, so Gita, it's a good question. People ask that. I'm not going to get into it, but right, you can't bring unsanctified animals into the Azara. So how do you do that? So I'm not going to get into it. It's a question people ask on this. But in any case, they say, Pesach b'Shabbat hechimatzi makdishle. There's a different problem, which is, how would they sanctify the animal when they got to the temple? They brought it, presumably, we're now saying, you were bringing it on that day on Shabbat. That's why they were carrying the knives in their wool or in their horns. So now they say, v'hatnan, it's a problem. It says in the Mishnah, ein makdishim, ve'en ma'arichim, ve'en machrimim, ve'en ma'bihim trumot u'masrot. Kol elu b'yom tov amru, kavachomer b'Shabbat. This is the Mishnah on Yom Tov. You're not allowed to sanctify items on Shabbat. You can't, erchin is to give the value of a person. You can't give cherem. It's also a type of sanctification. And you can't take trumot u'maschot. Why are all these things forbidden? The first three are forbidden because it looks like you're doing business dealings. It's similar to a business dealing by taking something that belongs to you and sanctifying it to the temple. And the trumot u'maschot, you're fixing something. So we talked about if you fix something, that's tikkun kli, right? It's like fixing a utensil, which would be a problem of either building or makeh b'patish, putting the final blow. So you're not allowed to do that. So how could they sanctify animals on Shabbat, which is exactly what we're discussing? So they answer, right, and that's forbidden on Yom Tov. Forget about Shabbat, which is always more strict. So they say, no, that Mishnah, Hanemile, those words are referring only to chovot she'en kavua lahem zman. Those are things that are voluntary offerings, where there's no set time associated with them. So you can't sanctify something when there's no set time associated with it on Shabbat, because you don't have to do it today. But if there's a set time for it, like the Korban Pesach, then you're allowed to. And here we see Rabbi Yochanan says it, that you're allowed to sanctify your Pesach on Shabbat or your Chagiga, that was the korbanot they brought during the holiday, on Yom Tov. Okay, so problem number one with these animals carrying the knives, how could we use consecrated items? We didn't consecrate them until we got to the temple. So when they carried them, they weren't consecrated. How do we consecrate them on Shabbat? Because specifically in this case, it's allowed since it was needed for that day. Second question. When this animal's carrying, it's like a donkey carrying a load on Shabbat. Now, you can't carry your donkey, you can't lead your donkey on Shabbat while it's carrying a load for you. That's having your animal work. Remember, we have shvitat behema, the animal can't work. This is also you working with the animal, you're leading the animal. It's a problem. So now it's not exactly the same, okay, because it's because you're doing this, this isn't carrying a heavy load. It's a little bit of a different kind of work, but still it's carrying something. So the answer, mechamer kila'achar yad. This is atypical, right? It's an atypical manner of carrying something by sticking in the wool of the animal. That's not the way the animal would normally carry something. So then they say, mechamer kila'achar yad nami. Nidi surado right aleka. Excuse me. Isur midirabana miya ika. They say, wait, that doesn't help you, right? We know that on Shabbat, if you do something in the atypical manner that it's done, so it drops it down from doraita to derabana, it becomes rabbinic, but it doesn't drop down to it's permitted. So it might help you that we don't have to worry about it being doraita, but it's still derabana. So how can you have the animal carry it in an atypical manner? So they say, hainu dekabaymine. This is exactly what they were asking. This is what Bnei B'Tera were asking him. Davar sheyesh lo heter min haTorah udvar shvut omed lefanav leokro kil'achar yad b'makom mitzvah mai. It's a long sentence. Something that's permitted by Torah law, like having this animal carry this item in its wool, okay, that or in its horns, that's something that's permitted from the Torah, but it's forbidden by rabbinic law. Dvar shvut yeshbo. That means it's rabbinic and it's forbidden by the rabbis. Would the rabbis allow if the rabbis institute that something is forbidden, maybe they would override it for the purposes of a mitzvah, as long as you do it in an atypical manner. That's what they were asking him. To which he responded, Amar lahen, halachazo shamati v'shachachti, right? I learned that, but I forgot it. Ela hanichu lehen Yisrael im'ei neviim hem b'nei neviim hem, right? And then he says, if the people aren't prophets, they're the children of prophets, right? And they know what they're doing. So I want to just, before we move on, I want to think about a few more things about this story. So first of all, you see that in the middle of the story, Hillel doesn't look very good, right? All of a sudden he's making fun of them and mocking them. And then he falls right into their trap and he can't answer the question properly. On the other hand, what does it show about him? It shows that he was willing to admit that I don't remember, which is very good. Not all leaders are willing to admit that. Sometimes they fumble through things or make up answers, right, and confidence and just say something that's not really true. So he wasn't willing to do that. He was very true to his Torah. And if you think about this line, I'm thinking about it because they even repeat it when they repeat this story, right? They want to repeat it and go honing in on this. And I think what he's saying is, I know I made a mistake. Think about it. He became the Nasi. Why? Because he knew the answer to a question that nobody else knew. And in the end, what happens? They ask him another question and he doesn't know the answer. Now, you would think at that point, they might think, we better get rid of this guy. We thought he knew what he was talking about, and he clearly doesn't know what he's talking about. And if our whole reason we brought him in was to be the Nasi because we thought he knew the answers to all our questions, then maybe we made a mistake. So first of all, we all know that nobody knows the answers to all questions. Everybody's human. But secondly, I think he has a reference to something more in these words. When he says, what he's saying is the fact that you appointed me to be the Nasi was also you acting as prophets, right? You might not have realized, but what you were doing was something you were supposed to do, right? Sometimes people act, and even though it might not fit logically with everything that's supposed to be done, maybe the idea is that what you did, don't think back and think you made a mistake. But what you did because you're B'nai Nevi'im, you had some sort of prophecy about you knew that I was supposed to be the Nasi. Right? And many people say that some people ask, why did they forget the halacha? Some people say the whole reason they forgot the halacha was in order to bring about Hillel's ascension to power. And that maybe that, again, there's many, many, many different ways to view this story. And wait, someone just wrote something that I was making me think about. 1 second. Right, that sometimes what's interesting about Hillel, I like that idea, Ruth, is that sometimes it's more important to know how to find the answer rather than to have all the answers. And what he had up his sleeve was a method for determining how to come up with an answer. So that's also right. Whereas their method was, we got to find somebody who knows. And maybe his lesson, this is actually a nice idea, Ruth, I like that you made me think about it, which is maybe the answer is that he's telling them, you don't have to go find the person who knows the answers. You have to have the tools. And maybe that's why, what was the problem for not being Shimesh Shmaya Vav Talyon? You don't only learn knowledge and information. What do you learn? You learn how to do things, right? You learn how to find answers. You learn tactics. And that's something he gained by, if you think about the words, it's not, you didn't learn, it's Shmaya Vav Talyon, lo shimesh. What is l'shamesh? L'shamesh is to be in their presence. And you get to see how to determine and how to deal with things when you don't know the answers. So lots of interesting ideas about this story. We're going to move on. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Kol hamityahel, anyone who is arrogant and says, I'm better than you, like or in our story, Im chacham hu chochmato mistaleket mimenu. Im navi hu nevuato mistaleket mimenu. We always have the chacham, the navi, right? The navi is the prophet. The chacham is the one who learns, right? And what's funny is Hillel, when they ask him the question, he brings up, right, nivuah, that, there's some ways of understanding things by logic, which is also like this kapachomer gzera shava, similar type idea, right? And then there's some that are b'mesoret that were passed down or that come through, so to speak, some sort of ruach hakodesh. So if you're a chacham, you're going to forget your knowledge. And if you're a navi, you're going to forget your prophecies. You're not going to be able to prophesize. Im chachamu, and that is basically saying if you're a leader and you abuse your power and use it to subjugate others or, be arrogant about it, you're not going to be a very good leader. You're going to lose your strengths. Here's your perfect proof. He was mocking them, and then he himself forgot. Where do we learn that from? Midvora dichtiv. Okay, Dvora in Sefer Shoftim, in Judges, she says there's a famous Shirat Dvora, and in that Shirah, you'll see two interesting things. It starts with Chalu Prazon b'Yisrael Chadelu. There were no more prophets in Israel or prophecies. Ad Shakamti Dvora, Shakamti Em b'Yisrael v'Gomer. It says until Dvora appeared, right? She's singing the song about herself. That's pretty arrogant. And then what does it say a few psukim later? Uri Uri Dvora, Uri Uri Dabri Shir. Wake up, Dvora, speak words of poetry, which is prophecies, meaning wake up because you forgot your prophecies. Rish Lakish Amar, Kol Adam shekoes, im chachamu chochmato mistaleket mimenu, im navihu nevuato mistaleket mimenu. Not only is it bad to be arrogant, it's bad to get angry. Okay, so here comes arrogance. So if you're, anger. If you're angry, im chachamu chochmato mistaleket mimenu. Shiur Chamutal and Daf Mishalahem this week talked all about anger and what anger, right? The dangers of anger. So anyone who gets angry, if he's a chacham, he forgets his chokhmah. Im navihu nevuato mistaleket mimenu. Same thing. Im chachamu. Now, who are we going to learn it from? Chokhmato mistaleket mimenu mi Moshe. Moshe Rabbeinu. Even though it's interesting, he was a navi and a chacham. But here we're going to see he forgot his knowledge, and therefore we're going to assume he's viewed as a chacham here. It says, "Vayitzaf Moshe al Pekudei HaChayil." This is at the end of Sefer Bamidbar when they get into the war with the Midyanim, and it says he got angry at the soldiers. And then it says, "Vayichtiv Vayomer Elazar Kohen el Anshe Hatzava be'im lamilchama." He then says, "Who speaks?" All of a sudden, Elazar comes in and speaks, and he says, "Zochukat HaTorah shesva Hashem at Moshe," and he goes through all the laws of how to kosher the utensils that you got from the Midyanim. Michlal de Moshe Iyalamine. From here, you can see that Moshe disappeared from the scene. Why did he disappear? Not disappear. He forgot the halacha, right? He didn't remember the halacha, and that's why Elazar had to come in and teach it. Im navihu nivuato mistaleket mimenu. From who do we learn this? Me'elisha dichtiv. Okay, the story is Yehoshaphat, the king of Yehuda, goes to war. He joins forces with the king of Yisrael, Yehoram. Yehoram is a big Avodah Zarah worshiper, never goes to the Navi. And Yehoshaphat says, "I'll only go with you if we go to the Navi." So they go to ask the Navi Elisha, and Elisha says to him, he gets very upset that Melech Yisrael is also with him. And he says, Lulei Pnei Yehoshaphat Melech Yehuda, saying, if it weren't for Yehoshaphat here, there's no way I would give you a prophecy. I wouldn't even look at you, right? Go, what do you need me for? Go to your own prophets. Right? He gets very angry. Uchtiv, and then what does it say? Bring me someone to play music for me, because he was obviously having trouble getting his prophecy. Amar of many bar Patish. Anyone who gets angry, even if God already designated you for greatness, you're going to lose it. Where do we learn this from? Minala me Eliav. He was the older brother of David. Dichtiv eshenemal. Vayichar af Eliav b'David. You remember they're all in the battle of Goliath. All his brothers go, and he's separate. It's kind of like the Yosef story. And then he goes to bring his brothers some food. And to hear, I don't remember if it was food or he also wants to hear. His father sends him to find out what's going on. And it's very similar to the Yosef story. And what's the response? Also, like in the Yosef story, the brother gets upset at him. He gets very angry, it says, Vayichar af b'David, and he says, Lama yaradita? What are you coming here for? And how'd you leave all the sheep? I know how bad you are, your bad intent. You just wanted to see the action. That's what you're doing here. And now, how do we see he gets punished? If you remember, Shmuel goes and he goes to all the sons of Yishai and he goes through the order. Remember, David's the youngest. And he says, not this one. I didn't choose this one. God didn't choose this one. God didn't choose this one. Now, by Eliav, it doesn't say God didn't choose this one. Don't be fooled by his looks, his good looks, and his height, right? Which was like Shaul. Kimi istiu, because I despise him. Now, what happened? From here, you see, it doesn't say Lobo Bachar Hashem, because Hashem apparently did choose him. And he had all the right things going for him. But because he got angry at David, he lost his ability to be the ruler. From here, you can infer God did want him to rule from the beginning. And he changed that when he got angry. Okay, last part for today's daf. Eshgachan tamidu Pesach didachu Shabbat. So we started today's daf with, we're now back to finish our story. We're now back to Korban Pesach and Korban Tamid. So we found out, okay, Korban Tamid overrides Shabbat, and from there we learned to Pesach. What about Dedachu Tuma Menalan? Where do we learn that you can do the Korban Pesach even if you're all impure? Remember, if the majority of the community or the majority of the Kohanim or Tmeim are impure, you're still allowed to do the Korban Pesach. Amre ki hechid yalif Pesach mitamid linyan Shabbat, hachinami yalif Pesach Tamid mi Pesach linyan Tuma. Just like we learned the Pesach from the Tamid in terms of overriding Shabbat, here we flip it, and we can learn from Pesach to every day that the Tamid also is Hutra. If all the people or all the Kohanim or Tmeim, it really would have to be all the Kohanim, because you don't need the people for the Korban Tamid, then you would be allowed to do it. Pesach gufe menalan. So where do you learn Pesach from? And here we're only going to start right now. We'll see more tomorrow. Amar Rabbi Yochanan brings proof to Amar Ka. Ish kiyeta nefesh. These are the verses about Pesach Sheni. It says a person who becomes impure to a dead person goes and does it on Pesach Sheni. So what do they learn? Ish nitchela Pesach Sheni ve'en tzibor nitchela Pesach Sheni ela avdei betuma. The only people who can do it Pesach Sheni are individuals. If it's the community, then they can all do it on Pesach Rishon. So Amar le Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish le Rabbi Yochanan. He says that's not a good drasha. Ema ish nitchela Pesach Sheni tzibor le'lu takanta. Lo b'Pesach Rishon, lo b'Pesach Sheni. Why don't you say the only option for Pesach Sheni is for individuals? If you're a whole group, you can't do Pesach Rishon or Pesach Sheni. You don't have a make-up chance, and you can't even do the first one. So you can't derive from there. Ela Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish mehacha. So let's learn it from somewhere else. It says, someone who has leprosy, someone who's a zav, has a discharge that makes him impure, and a tamei lanefesh. Now, if they can't be, then it would be obvious that zavinu mitzoraim also not. Obviously, they would also not be able to be anyone impure. Ella, what does it come to teach you? Why does it mention them also? Because it's trying to teach you, there's times when the zavinu mitzoraim are sent out, but the tmei meit are not. And that would be a case, it's to say that there's unique halachas by each. The tmei meit, the tumah hutra b'tzibur is only if they're all tmei meit, not all, the majority. But the zavu mitzora, if you have everybody zavimu mitzoraim, that doesn't help you. So they want to distinguish between these two, and that's to teach you. We'll continue more in this discussion tomorrow. We'll stop here for today. Have a good day, everyone.